This is the Internet Report, where we uncover what's working and what's breaking on the internet and why. I'm Angelique Medina, and I'm joined by my co-host, Archana Kesavan.
Hello, guys.
So this week, we are not going to be covering any major outage. We didn't really have one last week or one that really caught anyone's attention, but we do have an election coming up next week in the US, which is making news around the world, I'm sure. So we thought we'd take a closer look at some of the hosting of some of these election sites, voter registration sites, that sort of thing. Yeah. So we were looking at a dozen, well, actually 14 sites. We just picked some of the sites that are getting the most attention in terms of you know, their importance in terms of the election. So, yeah, let's dig into it.
Let's dig into it. We had some, kind of to set the context before we start looking at, shares here. This is something we've always been doing, when there is an interesting event coming around, like in 2000s fashion, like just to see what's going on and then kind of monitor. So like Angelique was saying, we're looking at about 14, 15 state election sites, and we've been tracking them over a couple of weeks now, I think, actually a little bit more than that as well. And we saw some interesting trends in terms of how they are hosted, what the architecture is. Do they have a CDN? Are they self-hosted or not? So there are a couple of nice differences there. We did see an outage in one of the site. And again, we're not tracking all sites. So, it was just one thing that caught our attention, which was interesting. So we'll walk over that as well. And then we'll discuss some pros and cons of, self-hosting versus not, and the impact of CDNs and so on. So let me go ahead and start sharing what we have here.
Yeah, and we're going to look at a specific example here, but I think what was really interesting to us is just kind of like a takeaway was that at least I was fairly surprised that nearly all of the sites that we looked at are front-ended by a CDN. Yep. Now that seems like that would be par for the course in terms of like any major kind of like modern application. Of course, it's fronted by a CDN. Yeah. But we've seen a lot of government sites that don't use one. And so it was surprising to me that almost all of them we looked at are fronted.
No, exactly. And I know we had this conversation like early on, in our podcast series where the unemployment website of New York had major issues. They actually had an outage for, a significant point in time. Yeah. And we noticed that they were self-hosted, right? And that was a discussion we had, and could clearly see where the packet drops were within their network or environment as well.
Yeah, so they were much more prone to congestion based on just fluctuations in usage. Whereas I think like New Jersey, which is borders New York, that particular state is like they were front-ended by a CDN and seemed like their performance was a little bit more even.
Better. Yeah. So, so in the same lines here, we're looking at Florida actually, and Florida clearly is, front-ended by Cloudflare, as we can see here. So we're just looking at it from different points across the US.
Because as we know, most people who live in Florida are accessing the site from other states. But, yeah. No, actually, it is. There are a lot of folks who live in Florida part-time. So
yeah, exactly.
It's partially true.
It is. No, actually, it is. I know
a lot of New Yorkers, too. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, they are thinking of making use of their voting registration in Florida. So yeah. So apart from Florida, we noticed Arizona and Georgia were other examples too that was using Cloudflare as their CDN. We noticed this is where we're looking at Colorado, and we noticed Fastly as another provider. We obviously saw AWS CloudFront in there. We saw Incapsula, Akamai. Mm-hmm. So kind of like all-around distribution of providers. No favoritism here in terms of which is the best CDN provider or not. And in terms of self-hosted, we saw a couple of specific sites. One was Iowa and the other one was Michigan, where we noticed that they were self-hosted. Like what we're looking at here is Iowa's registration website. There you go. You can see that they are self-hosted. Although for me, Angelique, like just looking at this, like what stands out is the lack of redundancy
Mm-hmm.
when you're self-hosting. We
And
saw
what
that.
we mean by that is that we only noticed one service provider connected to
Mhm.
them.
Exactly.
So, I mean, one of the advantages of having a CDN is just that you're eliminating those single points of failure. You have a distributed edge, and that whole edge infrastructure is connected to a lot of different service providers.
Mhm.
So, if you are going to self-host, one would think that you would think about things like redundancy if one provider has an issue, or and that issue could be physical, could be a routing issue, could be
Right.
cut. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can happen, and we were just not seeing that.
Yeah, definitely. And this is again just a couple of sites we've been tracking, right? So it's not something universal across all self-hosted election sites, but that was definitely an interesting thing that we noticed. And we had a couple of outages actually that we saw as well.
Well, I mean, not a complete outage from the
Fair.
standpoint of the site being totally unavailable, but I would say that, like, just from the standpoint of how slow it was probably functionally unavailable and down.
Yep,
If you're taking almost like
30
30
seconds.
seconds to
Mhm.
load a page, that doesn't sound very good.
Right. And this was specifically in Florida, the site related to Florida, where we saw this issue once in, on October 23rd. It wasn't very long, lived, just about half an hour around the afternoon, which is not terrible. And also East Coast, this is like, 6:30, not too bad. Again, but these are not like, enterprise used websites. So from a time perspective, like time of day doesn't matter. You could be logging on at any point in time to register.
Yeah.
Um, and again, very similar patterns here on the 14th of October as well, where, it wasn't dead, but it was
And about
super
the
slow.
same length of time too.
Yeah,
So it was
you're right.
about 30 minutes.
Mhm.
Same thing happened. I think the thing that's interesting about the incident on the 23rd is that it happened a day before their online voter registration closed. So that's kind of significant, just in terms of I'm sure they had an influx of folks that were trying to use the site and potentially could have experienced issues depending on what time of day they were trying to access.
Yep, definitely. That's true. Unclear what caused this on the 14th, although the patterns were very similar, but the 23rd could be related to that deadline on the 24th. So,
Well, what was interesting about both of these is that the network was not at
Mhm.
fault. It just really did seem to be something that was happening at the application layer, because we know that there wasn't like an increase in packet loss or latency during that period of time. So,
Yep.
there's something either in their web layer, maybe on the back end, they were having some issues. Maybe there's some maintenance. Who knows? But
Yep.
it wasn't network related from the standpoint of getting to the site.
Yep, definitely. That's an interesting observation as well. So yeah, so that's what we've been doing, just like taking a look at some of these sites to see what differences are there. What's the impact of the election coming close by. And the other thing with all CDNs is also that it offers a layer of protection and there is an added layer of security from a DDoS perspective, right? Like this is in
Yeah.
relation to like sites that you self-host versus not. It is possible that you do have a DDoS mitigation vendor in place, but with the CDN, if there is kind of a burst of traffic that comes in, they have the resource and infrastructure to kind of assimilate that. So that's definitely an advantage with respect to using a CDN as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So may not be in place to create, for better performance all the time, because a lot of the users are probably going to be fairly close to
Right.
where the site itself is hosted, or all of the data, because it's going to be like state users for the most part. So that's probably not like the biggest benefit. But to your point, the elasticity, being able to like scale based on spikes in usage, and then also the shielding of the site itself, so that it kind of defrays the impact of potentially a DDoS, and malicious traffic can get blocked and all that kind of stuff. It just makes it very easy. The other thing is that I think is interesting is that now that kind of like that period of registration is like now, I think in most states it's already
Most states
closed.
it's closed, yeah.
But there are a lot of folks that are doing things like tracking their ballots and looking for early voting sites and things like that. So they still are going to be utilized more than usual for the next week at least.
Yeah,
So it'll
definitely.
be interesting to keep an eye on that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think the other interesting thing that we noticed was, while the direct link to a registration or a voter site was self-hosted, I think this was an example with Iowa. It was not that all of Iowa's state-related, resources were self-hosted. Like for instance, I believe it was the Secretary of State website. You could reach the election voting place from there, but that particular URL was front-ended by Encapsula, for example. So it's not that, New York is another example too. We actually haven't checked New York's voter registration website, if that's front-ended or not. That
might be something we could look at. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, I mean, but to your point, I mean, it's kind of interesting that there's the architectural differences even within the same state and, different services, they're kind of being all in some cases hosted differently,
Yeah.
which makes me wonder kind of like, what is it the same kind of operational team that's like working on this, or these different teams that are not talking to each other?
It
Or
reminds
like,
me of,
yeah.
how an enterprise works too, from the perspective of cloud adoption, right? Like, different groups might adopt different cloud providers, and they're not really like, either they're not or they are talking, we don't know. But effectively, every organization in some form or fashion ends up becoming multi-cloud, even if, your particular org service that you're, operationally responsible for might be reliant on a single cloud. There could be that external dependence.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I would also say that, like, unlike an enterprise, it's even more complex with government because there's a lot of different state regulations that govern how data is collected and used within each state. And so it may be that certain things can be front-ended or can be hosted within a cloud provider's infrastructure and network, but others can't.
Right.
Like a lot of the unemployment sites that we saw earlier in the year were not front-ended, and there's some complexities there that we may not be aware of that are determining which ones can and can't. So that might also account for the differences.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Well, anything else that we saw interesting? I'm trying to recollect, but I think that was it.
I think that's it. I mean, it might be interesting at some point. We can also maybe even compare some of the differences with some of those larger states like New York and California versus those ones that we talked about, which are primarily either swing states or ones that are fairly important in terms of where an election falls. So we can maybe bring that up in another episode, and I would expect that they also have great kind of hosting, but you never know. So
yeah, you never know.
With that, I think that's our show today.
Right. Yeah. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and again, follow us on Twitter. And always, if you have questions, feedback, anything that you'd like to see, guests you would like to see featured on the show, definitely send us a note at internetreport@thousandeyes.com. And as always, you know where to claim your t-shirt. internetreport@thousandeyes.com. Send us your address, a t-shirt size, and we'll get that right over to you. Until then, have a good week.
Take care.